Okay, I've started the recording. First of all, and that will be the pattern for every week, any questions on what we did last week? So please unmute yourselves, everybody. I still see lots of people that are muted here. Any questions? No? Okay. If everybody's happy, then we'll proceed. Okay. So today is a kind of spin-off from the long introductory session. I will, by the way, upload a revised extended version of what I call the database. I spotted there were lots of mistakes here and there, things that could be added. I spread out the text as well. Some pages were cluttered. And as I said, don't be overwhelmed by it or impressed. It's just for reference, okay? Since we're talking about Western literature, which is such a huge category, I thought at least I'd give you the names and try to classify them as I did, okay? So from time to time, when I have the time or if I think of things, I'll revise it, but there's certainly a much newer version that will need uploading later on together with the PowerPoints today. There will be two. Okay, so today we're going to do the ways of reading. Yeah, that will take us beyond the break, I think. And then I'll present a context for the writers we're going to do next, which are Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe, therefore dealing with 19th century American literature and relation to history, specifically today focusing on what's called the American Renaissance. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. Everybody sees this?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. That's what I like, spontaneous reactions. Okay, ways of reading. First slide is a very basic one. It's just to give you a sense of the three categories that one comes across when one reads studies on literature, explanations of text. The first one, and you can see I've highlighted the terms to see that they are combined in three different combinations. The first one is the traditional approach of text in Western literature, pretty much despite newer approaches. The one that is kind of followed at school still, I would say, in many Western countries. I don't know here, and it's called usually literary criticism. So what it does, basically, it looks at the relationship between the literary text and the writer, the man and the works, okay? And it often takes two kinds of approaches, as I'll detail in the next slide. A historical approach, how the text is related to the culture of the times, the role of the influence on this or that writer, the tradition and the canon, a term I introduced last week, often based on universal criteria for appreciation, it has to be said. And also, it's not on this category, but we'll see it the next slide, a psychological approach. Then, let's say starting before the Second World War, in fact, published just afterwards, there's a work of reference published in 1948, 49, something called literary theory appeared. And basically what this means is that it sort of moves away from the kind of close reading, either history or psychology of the previous decades, to something which focused more on ideas, that's why it's called theory, on aesthetics, on philosophy, and it included a more what's called formalist approach to literature, looking at the text in themselves, okay, the way they are made up. And later on, I would say it started end of the 1950s, the heyday being 60s, 70s, and 80s, up to contemporary versions nowadays, something called critical theory started. Now, what it is, in fact, in most Western countries, it's a sort of institutionalization, an import, packaging, if you want, of various new ideas, new ways of approaching literature, of reading literary texts, being a literary critic, that come from so-called continental Europe, mainly French, but also German in some ways, but mainly French. And these had a big impact in Anglo-American universities. And since English remains the major language in the world, in all those institutions that use English as a teaching medium. So what theory did, what critical theory did, is it offered a more systematic, integrated approach to text, to literature, its relation to culture, being also concerned with structures and concepts. So it's a more technical approach, which features lots of concepts and sometimes new words. And at some point in the 80s, there was a broadening of literature, which stopped being only the central focus in humanities to more generally culture. Okay, so to detail this a bit more, literary criticism, and I refer here, I give you the reference of a book, which I think is very good, published recently in its new edition. There may be a new one even, by Wilfred Gehring, Handbook of Critical Approach. So as I said, literary criticism featured ways of reading literature according to mainly two tendencies. Oh, I have a few commentary, interestingly. Okay, so regardless of how they were classified, as I said, they can be divided into broadly two types of approaches. Okay, first, traditional approaches, which is what we see now, and the more recent theoretical approaches. So what are the more traditional approaches? As I said on the previous slide, it focuses on the man and the works. Okay? So you read and interpret the text, depending on what you know or what you can reconstruct about a writer's life.
喂，泰哲，嘿
Hello?
找我。哦，
What's that? There's a sort of lot of background noise, I don't know where, which is a bit difficult for me to... could whoever has background noise try to suppress this? So depending on which family environment the writer came from, the social background, his or her education, major life events, and the psychology. And one particular approach, in fact, is what's called biographical criticism. And it's a fairly now old-fashioned, old form of critical approach, because it looks at the writer's life, the biography, to see how, from the biography, one can understand the text the writer wrote, okay? So it's an early version of historical criticism because it looks at the life story in a sense, but it's one that's mainly focused also on sometimes on psychological reconstructions. This or that happened to the writer, it comes from this or that family background, and it impacts on what he or she wrote. Another traditional approach, but this is much more for what is called, as part of what's called textual studies, is of course to look at how a writer wrote their text, what influenced them. You know? Since there are German specialists here, in German it's called Quellenforschung, so literally source research or source study in English. So you look at the influences on this or that writer to have produced this or that text, okay? And obviously it considers also these in relationship to national culture and tradition. All this, of course, this kind of a traditional historical approach shapes what I briefly discussed when I introduced the lecture last week, the notion of canon, that is the set of classical texts that are deemed, judged to be worthy of being read or studied, okay? And this, in a sense, has to be traced back to the Romantic tradition of literature, which focuses on the artist and the individual creative genius. And in fact, quite a lot of 19th century, even history, the study of history, historiography, focuses on the great men in history, for instance, and therefore the great events and how they are related to great men. The study of literature at the beginning was pretty much done along those lines. Then, so if there are no problems, I move from slide to slide, yeah, okay? So don't hesitate to interrupt if there is something that is not clear and that you don't understand. So then we move on to the second category on the first slide, which is literary theory. And as I said then, it's a more formalist approach, which involved a closer reading of a given text. It's much less concerned with what's called the didactic function of literature. That is what literature can teach us, how it can teach us to be better human beings, the moral, for instance, of literature, the morality. And it looks at the text in its own right. So according to the internal rules of the formal and structural composition. So for instance, in fiction, since this course is mainly concerned with fiction, a formalist critic will look at any number of the following that characterizes a novel, a novella, or short story. The setting, and I give you basic definitions, where it takes place. The plot, so what happens to it, especially from the point of view of the major events that determine the unfolding of the text, of the action. The characters, obviously, especially the major ones, which in English are called the protagonists, comes from a Greek word which means the major actors. Okay, so the major figures in the text and how they interact. The structure, so the overall, let's call it architecture of the text's composition, which is partly determined, mistake there, by its genre. The style, so obviously how it's written, and it's important. And the themes, so the ideas, the topics, the recurrent motifs, even in some cases, the images. Okay. And in the Anglo-American world, which we're talking about here mostly, there are mainly two types of formalist approach. Okay. The one, again, more traditional, that could belong to the earlier category, which came with the rise of practical criticism between the two wars. And I give you a few major books here. Okay. And it's a variant of what in France is known as explication texte. So it's a close reading that tries to leave behind both a kind of a moral approach or one related to a writer's life, and that looks really at the text to try to understand how the text works. Okay. And a more, I would say, sort of slightly later version of that in the United States called New Criticism, a term derived from a book written by one of these critics, published during the Second World War, which also emphasizes close reading, but actually focused more on poetry, but also held the view that the work of literature functioned as a self-contained, self-referential aesthetic object. And I have the word aesthetic here in red, because this is what would distinguish, if you remember the previous slide, those critics from the previous version in Britain of these traditionalists, focusing on ideas of how a text is constructed, the formal construction of the text and the philosophy behind the construction of the text, let's say. So the American approach insists more on intrinsic value, and in fact they held the view of the work being impersonal to make sure you would not fall prey to determining the meaning of the work through what you know about the writer, and focus on the work of art as an independent unit of meaning. It is therefore also more aware of larger philosophical, theoretical issues related to literary texts. And the classic that introduced this notion of literary theory is Welleck and Warren. So a work that they wrote piecemeal during the war and didn't get published until after the war, and especially the fourth chapter, in which they tried to come up with a more systematic view of how to approach literature that would not only still include history, for instance, but all these new ideas that I've just presented, okay. Literary theory, criticism, and history. So Nucleists are interested in how a set of devices operate in the text, and these are some of the terminology they use. Some of them are now a bit old-fashioned, but some have also had an impact on later approaches to literature. Images and symbols or allegories, these are in a sense from all ages, so we still deal with those. Between brackets here, I mentioned what an allegory is. It comes from a Greek, which means to speak otherwise. So therefore, it deals with stories or images which have several layers of meaning behind the literal or the surface meaning. Okay. And this is one of the ways in which meaning operated in the Middle Ages. There was a literal meaning, and there was something which was more figurative, and it was called allegory. Okay. A term which is very specific to new criticism in the States, and which is not used very often now in that sense, the tension, and I describe here, but one which is again of all ages in many ways is irony. They were really interested in how the intended meaning is the opposite of that expressed by the words used. Okay? And also other forms like a paradox, statement contrary to received opinion or belief, or ambiguity. There was a famous book, early book, written by a British scholar this time, which is a precedent to this concern with ambiguity. And the former in particular anticipates what I'll present later on in this lecture as deconstructive modes of reading. So despite the fact that it's an old, fairly old form of critical response now, but one that was dominant in the United States for like maybe 3 decades easily, some of the concerns are not so far from one of the newer approaches called deconstruction. And the point of view as well, what they call point of view, or the speaker's voice in their own word, which in fact somehow prefigures something that you know in China because it's very popular, narratology, okay? When you talk about agency and points of view. What these new critics did, as said, to counter previous approaches, is to denounce 2 types of what they call fallacies, subjective fallacies, so wrong ways of approaching literature. The first one, the better known, but the 2 work together, the second is a continuation of the first one, is what they call the intentional fallacy. So what is it? It's the fact that the author's intention is relevant to understanding of work of literature. Because, and that's a quote here, the design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as the standard for judging the success of the work of literary art. So what they're saying is that we may know what the intended wanted to say, but it does not exhaust the meaning of the work. Otherwise, we would have nothing to say as readers. We would just have to know what the author had to say, what he wanted to express, and that would be it. Okay, so no, this is wrong. This is a fallacy. Okay? And equally wrong is a term that the same critics, Wynne, Sapp, Beers, they call 3 years later, call the affective fallacy, referring to affect. Therefore, the supposed error of judging or evaluating a text on the basis of its emotional effects on a reader. Okay, so for instance, in this case, and that it's a way of saying, of countering the moral judgments of literature that happened before. You think a text is good because you like it. No, you may have your subjective opinion. It has an effect on you. Some texts have are more effective than others on us. And you think, therefore, it's good literature. No, it's on your subjective opinion. Yeah. Somebody else might disagree. I leave aside the one at the bottom, which is kind of a now old form of criticism, in a sense called archetypal criticism, that deals with myths and archetypes, and especially associated with a Canadian critic who is kind of in between American new criticism and the next mode of approach, one of the next mode of approach that I will present under critical theory. So here I have several modes there, okay? So what is it as a whole new range, broad range of critical methods that have been applied to literary works since the end of the 50s, with the exception of Marxist criticism and psychoanalytic criticism, which originated earlier. As I said, it's a way of trying to bring new ideas and new concepts in the way one reads or rereads literature. So the first one, and one that I suppose is known here in a certain flavor, is Marxist criticism. And it has also a huge tradition in the West, more generally. So what does Marxist criticism do in general? It looks at literary works as reflections of the social institutions from which they originate, rather than as independent individual productions. Okay, so it's rooted in the social and in the collective, and that, as I said here, which means that it goes against the notion of romantic genius, okay, individual genius. According to Marxist critics, literature is a social institution with a specific ideological function that is based on the author's background and ideology. And the forms, the styles, and meanings of a literary work are seen as the product of a particular history. So it is therefore related to 2 joint factors, as it were: history, the way ideology is always a product of history at any particular time, and society, the collective. Okay. No matter its flavor, the traditional goals of Marxist criticism include the following: assessing the political tendency of literary work to determine whether its social content or its literary form are progressive or reactionary. And the term here equated with reactionary is bourgeois. That was used a lot by Marxist critics. That's the sort of first tendency. A slightly more sophisticated approach is to analyze the narrative of class struggle in a given text, whether it serves to perpetuate the ruling class or to subvert it. That's especially the case of satirical novels or dystopian novels. That is, a dystopia is a world that goes bad, and often a dystopian novel is a way of commenting on a form of contemporary society somewhere. Okay. Same as satire. Or sometimes, it happens, and I give an example here in English literary history, to signify both at the same time. So that novel by Dickens, for instance, has been shown by Marxist critics to both offer a criticism of capitalism while seeking the perpetuation of the class structured society. Okay, so on the one hand, it's traditionalist; on the other hand, it's more revolutionary. Okay, so this is what the basic aims of Marxist criticism does. And on this slide, I won't comment much on the. There's usually a second slide with some key texts. The first one I want to draw your attention to, because again, there are Germanists here. Georg, or Georg in German, Lukács, a well-known Marxist theorist of Hungarian origin, that wrote in German, which is why he has these two first names here. And he's one of the earliest Marxist theorists, with the theory of the novel 1920. I think it's the earliest such book that exists in the West. Okay. I draw your attention to the last one in particular here, in which there is a chapter that opposes what he calls critical socialism to a well-known form of politicized art in the 20th century, socialist realism. And the others are better known names in either British or American criticism, with the exception of Pierre Macheret, who was a French theorist, active in the previous decades, that wrote this famous book in 1966, A Theory of Literary Production. Potentially included in this category, and I call them neo-Marxists, are people, though, that one leaves out because they're usually concerned with culture rather than have anything to say on literature. And again, they are relevant for the Germanists because they are attached to what is known as the Frankfurt School. Okay? So they have historically been sociologists, psychologists, and cultural critiques. In fact, they invented something called Kulturkritik, which means cultural critique, rather than literary critics and theorists. And I mentioned one name here in particular, is Herbert Marcuse. Okay? The only exception that is related to this group is a French Romanian-born critic called Lucien Goldman that, again in the 60s, which saw a lot of new theories, wrote this book on sociology of the novel. Is everything still fine so far, people? Yes?
Yes.
I don't hear anybody. Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, is that fine?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I was like, I heard complete silence as it were. Any questions so far? No? Again, as usual, I will upload the PPTs and reread them at home. And if you have questions, I'll take them the week after as well, if you can't think of questions on the spot. Okay, another type of approach. This is the one that I said has been going on for a while as well, is psychoanalytic criticism. It covers a range of different approaches nowadays, but it starts from obviously the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. And what it does basically, what they all have in common is that they view literature as fundamentally entwined, connected with the psyche. Okay, so literature, the text, is a product of some sort of personality, psyche, unconscious, depending on what terms you use, depending on the approach. Now, here again, there's an older, more old-fashioned, a bit crude at times and mechanical approach, and there are newer models. So the older one can be called psychological or psychobiographical criticism, and as the name indicates, it basically looks at does a psychoanalysis of the author or of a fictional character, and on that basis constructs the meaning of the work. Yeah? So it relates the behavioral patterns to what one knows of a writer's life or of the way the characters behave to an author or psyche on the basis of what is known in his or her life. Okay? And this supposedly stems from Freud himself, the way, for instance, Freud derived some of his major concepts, like the Oedipus complex, from ancient tragedies, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, as he first discussed in The Interpretation of Dreams, one of his first important books. Or we can look at Freudian slips, what they reveal of their unconscious, or the id, ego, and superego. So applying various concepts from Freud, how he himself sometimes derived them from literary works, okay? And how these influence fictional characters' thoughts, speeches, and behaviors. But the problem with this method, and why I said it's rather traditional and old-fashioned even, is that it's rather crude, and it conflates the author and his or her creations. And I would say now, although there are different schools, but there's a kind of general assumption whereby characters in a fiction, even if they're sometimes based on the life of the writer, they are so-called partly autobiographical, ultimately they are not to be confused with the author. Okay? The author is the person in real life, and even if he writes himself or herself into the fiction, the moment it's on paper, it's something else. It's a paper character. Okay? Now, there is a more sophisticated approach which consists in applying a psychoanalytical model to the text's own narrative or poetic structure. And why it's more sophisticated is because rather than, again, determining meaning based on the writer's life, something which is external, it deals with, it connects the method with the internal properties of a literary text. Okay? So, for instance, in line with this perspective, the founding text of psychoanalysis themselves can be treated and read as literature, okay? Because you can look at their formal qualities or their theoretical content. And in fact, this is also in line with Freud's own text, which resemble detective stories or even archaeological narratives. Okay? So basically, you don't use the theory as a kind of crude grid through which to read the novel, for instance, but you can also look at the texts themselves, whether they are literary or psychoanalytical, in terms of these concepts. So these are for the kind of historical flavors, as it were. And there are also three major types of frameworks for interpreting literary text, each of which is related to the three major psychoanalysts. And so the Freudian one is the one I've been concentrated on, and it remains the better known one. One which is much less common, also because more difficult to apply, is the one that's related to a Swiss analytical psychologist called Carl Jung, which emphasized archetypes, symbols, and the collective unconscious. So as opposed to Freud, who talked about individual unconscious, this one talked about the collective unconscious. Okay? And this is also why it's more difficult to apply to literature, in fact, where there are individual entities as opposed to collectivities. And the more recent one that has to do with the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the one at the bottom of the slide here, the Lacanian approach, whose major view, so it's a kind of post-Freudian, he was very heavily influenced by Freud. And what he added to Freud is the fact that there is a strong relation between language and the imaginary and the unconscious. So it's a more linguistic, it tends to be a more linguistic reading of psychoanalytical mechanisms in literary text. And there's a feminist variant of that, which is illustrated by Julia Kristeva, a French, Bulgarian-born critic that is known as a French feminist, but also a psychoanalyst. There's, I mentioned in passing, because we'll find his name later on under deconstruction, there is an American critic called Harold Bloom, who adopted a Freudian notion of the Oedipus complex, and he adopted it for his study of relationships between poets, what he called the anxiety of influence. Okay? So what he meant for him is that there are ways in which each writer is aware of what comes before him and tries to misread the writer in order to be able to create something new. Okay, so he uses a kind of the psychoanalytical mechanism of anxiety to see how it's an engine for literary creation, for new literary creations. Okay. I'll return to that briefly when I deal with deconstruction. Here, rather than give you although there are also under the C, also there are texts, like textbooks as it were, related to this approach. What I thought would be more interesting is to give you examples of how the psychoanalysts themselves have read literature, if you're interested. So obviously, there's going to be more here under Freud and Lacan for the reasons that I mentioned. And Jung is not so applicable to literature, and he has himself commented so very little on literature, apart from the final chapter in James Joyce's novel Ulysses. So these are the major known texts. There are others, of course. Most of these for Freud have been gathered in a collection called Writings on Art and Literature, and I've indicated here the major ones. Okay, one is very relevant. It's the one called The Uncanny, because later on in the semester, we look at E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman, and it's a notion that he derived after one of his colleagues, in fact, from the way this operates in Hoffman's short story. Okay. Then there's Jacques Lacan, who also was read a lot of literature and wrote about literature. And here again, one of his writings on literature will be important when we will look at Poe. Yeah? The Purloined Letter that we'll see later on, after Melville. There's an extremely important seminar on the Purloined Letter that he gave in 1956, which has generated a lot of debate afterwards. Okay, and on the occasion of this text, I'll try to present you the main lines of this really extremely important critical debate. And I'll also give you other important texts. As you can see, quite a lot of at least two writers here worked on Joyce. Lacan did quite a lot of work on Joyce towards the end of his life. And Julia Kristeva, what's interesting about her, as I said, she's a French feminist and psychoanalyst, but she also became a novelist, in fact. So she can sort of now deal with literature both as a critic, as it were, as a practitioner. And I've given here perhaps the most relevant works that deal with writers in the canon. She wrote other books. She was, as I said, a psychoanalyst. She was a semiotician as well. So in an earlier part of her life. So these are the works that are more relevant from a psychoanalytic point of view. Is that fine so far? Yes?
Yes. Yeah.
If no questions, again, I don't hear anybody. I'll move on. Structuralism. This is a term no doubt you have heard of. In many ways, it's the first major critical theoretical school after the Second World War, from which the notion of critical theory was imported into Britain, into the United States, and to quite a lot of the so-called Western world, which Western world is like at large, really, like Australia, the Western world from this point of view. And it means this. It started in the 50s in different branches of the humanities, sociology, anthropology, linguistics. And it's a method of analysis according to which elements of the text must be understood in relation to a broader overarching system or underlying structure. And in literature, in the study of literature, sorry, it's a mistake here, it gave rise to three major currents. One of which, as I said, you know here. It's one of the basic approaches in China, a new version of it, called narratology. The word was coined by Tsvetan Todorov in the 60s, and it refers to the study of the structure and function of narrative, the points of view, etc., especially as analogous to linguistic structure, as well as the examination and classification of the traditional themes, conventions, and symbols of a narrated story. And here are the major names between brackets, apart from Todorov. Poetics which, because it derives from Aristotle's work, and you remember last week what I said the word meant. It's not only related to poetry, and in the same way, poetics, in fact, designates a general theory of literary forms, okay? So not only for poetry. Okay? And again, here we have Genet and Todorf as the major names. And one trend which is less represented and especially connected to this French writer who moved to the States, stylistics, in which you look at, well, the stylistic structure, as it were, of a literary text. Because schools don't work independently of one another, there are occasionally precursors and crossovers between schools. And in this case, because it's a formalist approach, a precursor can be found in a Russian formalist critic known as Vladimir Prop. Yeah? So he's a Russian formalist. He wrote much earlier on, but his famous study of the folktale, published in 1928, was rediscovered 30 years later, translated, and is one of those Russian formalist texts that made an impact on structuralism. Okay? And in there, he discusses 31 narrative functions in a folktale and 7 broad character functions or roles. So what he does, he takes examples of folktales, and he said he can't take them all, but each folktale for him has at most the whole range of these functions, and in one way or another, regardless of the story, regardless of the individual characters, has the 7 broad character roles of functions. The hero, the villain, the princess, etc., and so on and so forth. There is also, as I said, I mentioned it before, but I don't want to spend too much time on it, but there is also, I mentioned in passing, a certain similarity between structuralist literary theory and Northrop Frye's archetypal criticism that I mentioned at the end of my slide on new criticism, yeah, which is also indebted to anthropological study of myths and which takes precisely a kind of broadly structuralist understanding of literary text. Some critics have also tried to apply the theory to individual works, but the problem there, because it's a structuralist model, so it has something that talks about the general framework, is that it tends to run counter to the individuality of a literary work. Yeah? So you have a structuralist program that tries to look at texts above individual cases, and therefore it becomes difficult to apply these back to individual cases, to read each text more closely. Yeah? And in a sense, this is when new criticism is still relevant. It sort of focuses more on the individual text as opposed to a structuralist method. So what are the key studies, among others, because there's so many others I could have mentioned here, but the key studies of this type of approach? First of all, there is a very interesting jointly written study by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was perhaps a 20th century leading anthropologist, and Roman Jakobson, who started as a Russian formalist, then joined the Prague Linguistic School and became a structuralist. He wrote for about 60 years of the 20th century, so he could do that. And they produced a kind of token reading of a poem, a 19th century French poem by Baudelaire. And it's the best known instance of an attempt at close reading a text written by 2 structuralists, one a structuralist anthropologist and the other one who was steeped in Russian formalism, to show how you apply a structuralist model. So it's like it demonstrates the applicability of the structuralist method on a literary text. And it's an incredibly detailed study of a literary text, breaking it down into atoms almost, based on a structuralist model of analysis. Names that I mentioned before are on this slide as well. Todorov, so here are the 2 texts that he wrote that are connected to the structuralist period, that are more specifically focused on examples of how you apply it. One is on Boccaccio's Tale of the Decameron, which is an example of structuralist semiotics. And another one is on one whole genre, the fantastic, a structural approach to a literary genre. Then comes somebody who is an interesting figure because he straddles both the structuralist and the post-structuralist currents. And in fact, the text I mentioned here, SZ, is poised. It's like a detailed analysis of a short story by the 19th century fiction writer Balzac, according to 5 codes, but each time he shows that you need to go beyond these structuralist codes And in fact, it criticizes, as he details these codes, the propensity to establish an overall system from which narratives are created and never does justice to the individuality of the story. Okay, so for him, as he tries to conduct a kind of structuralist analysis, in a sense, like we saw functions before, in his case he has codes. As he details them more and more, you can see that the codes break down just under the sheer specificity of the text that he's analyzing. And he says that ultimately, and this is why it's an important turning point in this critic's career, is that he sees that the structuralist method has its limits and ultimately makes the text lose its specificity. And beyond that is indeed what we will call post-structuralism. And then there's another writer that I mentioned, Rifater. Why I mentioned these two texts, there are others, is that the first one, Derrida, is a French philosopher whom we'll see very soon. And what's interesting is that his method can be applied not only to literary texts. He was interested in what is called literarity, what makes a text literary. But for him, any text could be potentially literary. So what he does in the first text that I mentioned here, which it's a French title because it hasn't been translated into English, The Trace of the Intertext. He closely reads the first page of one of Derrida's most difficult philosophical texts, but which is endowed indeed with literary qualities, to show that, yes, literariness is not only a quality that you can find in so-called literature. You can have it, for instance, in something called philosophy. Okay, I think this is, I won't be quite done. We'll have a break in 3 minutes. So this is the last, there will be 2 more afterwards. The last theoretical trend that I'll present before the break. And this is already reader response criticism. This takes us into post-structuralism, okay? What happened with before, so if you look at the trajectory of how one read literature in the 20th century, at first you read the text in connection with the author. You had to know the author's life to interpret the text. Then came those approaches that focused on the text. Yeah? New critics and also structuralists, even if it was a generalized model. Then comes those approaches that focus on the reader. So the third, so far, neglected component, okay? And it's therefore part of the growing dissatisfaction with the structuralist methods, and it registers the shift of emphasis from the text, endowed with inherent structures, to the reader, whom they called audience, as the center of perception, experiencing a literary work and activating its meaning. So for those people, meaning doesn't reside in the text. It's always something that depends on how we read, individually and collectively, okay? So in that sense, it stands in opposition to formalist theories, and especially new criticism, in which the reader's role is ignored, okay? Now, what's interesting is that there are several critics that, as I said, were formerly associated with structuralism, Roland Barthes, but also Umberto Eco, known as a writer who started as a semiotician, also turned to reader response criticism, okay? The crucial text there is another text by Barthes, The Death of the Author, in which he wants to leave the author behind because for him it's just a symbol of authority, of the canon. But he says that the death of the author means the birth of the reader. So although he focuses on the text, he puts the author to death in order to free the reader in order to read the text. Okay. And same Umberto Eco, who, as I said, started as a structuralist semiotician, and then wrote about, you can see in the keywords here, about the role of the reader, exploration semiotics of text. So he applied his skills as a semiotician to the role of the reader, how a reader reads a text. Yeah? There is also a related trend here, which is part of this kind of it's a rather loose category, reader response criticism, and it's one again that's of interest to the Germanists. Yeah. It's known as reception theory, and it emphasizes how a particular reader or community of readers, an American critic called it interpretive communities, receives and establishes meaning from literary text. So in this case, the emphasis is more on the collective reception of a text in certain kinds of traditions. And one of the key names there are 2, in fact. There's for Wolfgang Iser, so you recognize 2 German names. Wolfgang Iser, The Implied Reader, okay, 1972, and also Hans-Robert Jauss, who wrote about aesthetics of reception. And what he does in particular is to develop a concept, which in German is called Erwartungshorizont, or horizon of expectation, to designate the structure by which a person comprehends, decodes, and appraises any text based on the cultural codes and conventions particular to their time in history. So what he's saying, what these critics are saying, is that even if we read individually, the way we can understand or sometimes fail to understand the text is based on the kind of education that is available to us at a certain time in history, in a certain country, society, whatever. Therefore, we expect, when we read the text, we expect certain things as opposed to others, okay? And this is according to these horizons of expectation that we can read or may not be able to read literary text. Okay, we'll have a break, 10 minutes, yeah? And we'll reconvene at 56, it's 46, yeah. Okay, so let me resume the recording and the presentation. Okay, so there are in fact three more theoretical canons to present. This one, so the next one, deconstruction, sometimes known as deconstructive criticism. I don't like the term that much, but deconstruction was, as it were, coined or made popular by one of the best known philosophers in the 20th century, Jacques Derrida, Frenchman. And it had such an impact on literature that people call it specifically deconstructive criticism. And of all the currents that I've mentioned, it's perhaps the one that has had the greatest impact on not only literature, on practically any field in the humanities and the social sciences. Okay? So what is it? It basically, I need to cut a long story short here. Basically, you remember I mentioned some affinities with some ways of reading in your critics, looking at tension, at ambiguity, irony, etc. It basically tries to read a text, I would say, against the grain, as I say here, okay? So by looking for elements that run counter to the intended meaning of the text structural unity. Yeah? So even if there's an intent by the writer to say something, a deconstructive approach will always look at those signs that just go against that intended meaning, okay? And the famous phrase that I mentioned is that it deconstructs itself. So it's a structure of any literary text and any text in general to, as it were, to be deconstructing itself. And the purpose of such an approach is to show that the use of language in a given text and language as a whole is irreducibly complex, unstable, and marked by, and it's a key term that they use, difference. So deconstruction denotes the pursuit of the meaning of a text to the point of exposing the supposed contradictions and internal oppositions upon which it is founded. So the first text that made people aware of this approach is the text he gave at a well-known conference in the States that I mentioned here, 1966. That's in the second paragraph. And it's one of the points of departure for what is known as post-structuralism, because in this text, in a conference that was supposed to celebrate structuralism, he basically highlighted, pointed out some of the theoretical limitations of structuralism, especially how it conceived of the structure and the center. So whereas structuralism viewed language as unified around the sign, what Derrida proposed is that signs always refer to other signs and only exist in relation to one another, and that therefore there was no ultimate foundational center to determine meaning. Okay. And that's totally anti-structuralist. In the 70s, so after this conference went in the States, one decade later, this became imported into American universities, in University of Yale, and that's why it's known as the Yale School of Deconstruction, which lasted about a decade there, which is a loose grouping of those various people that I mentioned and whose names will reappear with some major publications on the following slide. So here they are, and here I can't list all the text, but at least I wanted on this slide to detail some of Derrida's own readings of literary text. Why deconstruction has been so important as a way of reading and rereading a literary text is because he has himself, even though he's a philosopher, written about loads of writers. You know, this is only a selection. So much so that there is actually a volume called Acts of Literature that was published in 1992 that gathers some of his best known readings of writers and literary texts, and in which he gave an interview on the institution of literature. But I mentioned a few other texts here, and one of which will again be relevant when we deal with post-text. It's the one called Le Facteur de la Vérité. I will explain the text when I lecture on this. It can't be translated. It means two things in French. And it's Derrida's reply to Lacan's reading of Post, the prolonged letter that we will see in a few weeks' time. He also talked about Melville, and I'll mention that next week. I won't have time to talk about Melville today, but I'll spend about 20, 30 minutes before we look at the text to give you a short presentation on Melville, in which he mentioned our story, Bartleby the Scrivener, which he saw as having the epitome of what he called the secret of literature in that piece called Resistances. Other critics that were mentioned on the previous page, Hillis Miller, the best known, most faithful, as it were, deconstructionist critic, who was trained as a Victorian, wrote on this range of writers that I mentioned. But again, a bit like Derrida, though focusing more on an Anglo-American canon, he wrote on a whole range of 19th and 20th century texts from the deconstructive perspective. Paul de Man, who was born in Belgium, had a different background. He was specialist in English and German Romanticism, and of the publications he wrote, the first important book, this one there, is the one that's known as de Man's specific brand of deconstructive criticism, as well as the later one on the rhetoric of Romanticism. The last one, Harold Boone, is the one that I mentioned, is loosely connected to him, the one whose name we came across before, and he's the one who also applied a kind of broadly psychoanalytic perspective to the way he saw the relationship between two literary figures in The Anxiety of Influence, a theory of poetry. As I said, in this particular approach, there is much more than could be said. One could have a whole course on this because it is incredibly vast. In a sense, same for feminist criticism, and which also broadened into more generally gender studies. So what is feminist criticism? It obviously uses principles and ideologies of feminism, so whether as theory or politics, to analyze and critique the ways in which the language of literary text portrays and relays the narrative of male domination, and I highlighted the word patriarchal here, patriarchal society or patriarchy, by exploring the economic, social, political, and psychological forces embedded within literature. So it is often combined with some Marxist approaches. You can see some common ground here. It's a way of thinking, criticizing works that has changed the way literary texts are viewed and studied, as well as changed and expanded the canon of what is commonly taught. It itself has a complex history, which is broadly made up of these three currents: the French feminists, who are more theoretical, supposedly, and one key concept was coined by somebody who was a French critic, but also became a well-known writer, Hélène Sixou, écriture féminine. It's left in French. It means feminine writing, as it were. Okay? And The Laugh of the Medusa is an extremely important critical text, beautifully written, that puts forward this notion of a kind of writing which is not only specific to female writers, but that male writers can also adopt a certain feminine position in language when one writes. As opposed to that, there's the so-called Anglo-American feminists, which see themselves as more pragmatically activists and against the more supposedly theoretical French critics. But these two approaches have been opposed by non-white, so-called third world feminists, by saying that these perspectives are very, very nice, but they basically do not, they come from the first world and they do not deal with women's concerns and struggles outside the first world. And they are, in a sense, therefore complicit with the first world powers of oppression that silence women from developing countries. Okay? And this is one of the new tendencies, so much so that nowadays one talks about feminisms, plural, rather than simply feminism. Okay? So before the 1970s, feminist literary criticism was concerned with women's authorship and the representation of women's condition within literature. And in a sense, it followed the trend whereby people focused on the relationship between the author and the text, and in particular the depiction of fictional female characters, and tried to bring women writers into the literary canon. But since the broadening of women's studies into gender studies, that has been applied to not only women, but also people in the queer community, and has further contributed to expanding the role of a variety of identities within this kind of now broad set of theories. I mentioned a few texts here. So the prototype of French, if not feminist theory, but at least a feminist approach, is Simone de Beauvoir just after the war, The Second Sex, who asked the question, what is a woman? And she famously says, it's something which is very well known now, one is not born a woman, one becomes one. I.e., it's society that makes you into what it is, subservient to man. Various critics here, French theorists at first, Rugaray and Sixou, and then two key American critics, Ellen Showalter, and they come together, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, who wrote an extremely important work, The Mad Woman in the Attic, that kind of reread 19th century text as feminist text, precisely, to try to see how they were complicit with patriarchy. And further texts that I give you here, two in particular at the bottom, which are interesting. Judith Butler was a very well-known name now. We have a colleague in SJTU, Professor Dulan Lam, who's a specialist on Judith Butler. This one is important because it marks the beginning of gender studies, so the broadening of feminist theory into gender studies. And F. Kosowski-Sedgwick, whose book, Epistemology of the Closet, marks the beginning of queer theory. Okay, so you can see that the broadening of feminist theory into these started some 30 years ago. And the last theory, and to be the end of this first presentation, has to do with postcolonial criticism. So broadly speaking, what postcolonialism does, or postcolonial studies, is to study the cultural legacy of colonialism, therefore including colonialist discourse and imperialism, focusing on the human and political consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people, including as slaves and their lands. More specifically applied to literary theory, it deals with the literatures produced by the peoples who were once colonized by imperial powers. Whether these are written in the language of the colonizers, some carried on writing in them, or indigenous languages that may then have achieved natural prominence after independence. And what a postcolonial literary critic does, what the criticism does, is to comprehend literatures written both by the colonizer and the colonized. So it's not only the former colonized people writing whatever literature after independence, but it also rereads literature by the so-called colonizer in a postcolonial way. Okay. There are various key themes that one can spot across the whole range of postcolonial critics, and they include race. So just as there is an interface between feminist criticism and gender studies, there is an interface between postcolonial criticism and race studies. Nation and nationhood, in particular, a name Homi Bhabha is interested in that respect, as is hybridity. So the process of the emergence of new cultural forms from multiculturalism. The subaltern, which you'll see on the next slide, which is a concept that Gayatri Spivak coined, and which refers not to the oppressed more generally, but specifically to those that have limited or no access to the cultural imperialism. Okay. So it's not people that are suppressed, it's people who simply have no access to ways of expressing themselves. And that approach also looks at texts that themselves rewrite, let's say, colonial texts in a post-colonial way. And there are two famous examples in the history of Anglo-American literature. One is Jane Eyre, rewritten by a West Indian writer, and you can see the description here. And the other one is another very canonical English text, Robinson Crusoe, rewritten by a South African writer, as Foe. So some key text. There is a precursor for this type of approach. Everybody cites Franz Fanon, somebody of West Indian origin, who was trained in medicine and psychology, and wrote an absolutely scathing analysis of the destructive nature and effects of colonialism on native people. Okay? But the post-colonial critics themselves, the best known ones include the ones that I've mentioned here. And you can see there, in each case, I mentioned their origins because it's quite interesting how they come from countries where one spoke English that are connected to England, Britain in one way or another, whether it's the former Palestine or Bengal or Indian more generally. Okay, and you can see the type of text that they wrote here. So the ones I want to kind of draw your attention to in particular is kind of the Subaltern Speak, perhaps one of the best known essays, and as well as the text by Homi Bhabha. The last one is an instance and one of the best known and perhaps earliest instances of the so-called third world feminism that I call, so the non-Western, non-white approach to feminism, and it's called Under Western Eyes, and it was published in 1986. So that marks, in a sense, the beginning of the critique of Western feminism's constructions of the category of the third world woman as generic and homogeneous. Okay, this is it for this presentation. Any queries, any question on this? Any questions? Okay, no questions? I can't hear anything again. It's because most people are mute again. Okay, I'll move on to the next presentation, which I hope I'll sort of finish. This is, let me just open it first. And share the screen. Everybody can see this? Everybody can see this?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, yes. Okay, good to know that you're still here. Okay, change of flag now. American Renaissance. So what this is basically, it's an introduction to 19th century American literature, of which we'll see two examples on this course, and how it relates to what one needs to know basically about American history. So in a sense, 19th century American history is, I feel like saying, the beginning of history for the country we know as the United States. It was independent. It turned independent in 1776, and the revolution that lasted some 20 years to the Civil War, so mainly against the abolition of slavery, stakes out the period during which the so-called American history kind of took off with the American dream, the Western movement, and the notion of the frontier. So all the foundational myths that make up the beginnings of America, the United States, as an independent nation, post-independence. So at the beginning, before turning to the major writers of the American Renaissance, including the one that we will see later on, and Melville will come next week, I want to give a few pointers to understand what these notions mean here. So what is the frontier, what's called the American frontier? So it comprises the geography. So let's remember that America, when it was first settled, was settled mainly on the eastern coast. Yeah, this is where the so-called fathers, the Pilgrim Fathers, landed. And as time went by, they went further and further westward. But they first started on the eastern coast, especially New England, so-called, northeast, on the eastern coast. But it also comprises the history, folklore, and cultural expression of life related to American expansion. So the frontier means precisely the way Americans, those settlers, saw the myth of this new American identity as being defined by the expansion, the westward movement, it was called, to try to conquer land and to settle beyond the first line of civilization. And that, in many ways, has created, like I said, a strong myth which contributed to shaping American character, nationalism, and democracy. And I've given you here two examples. of the people I'll be presenting later on, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the essay called The Young American, and the famous preface to Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the first major collection of poems in 19th century American literature. These people were known as the pioneers, and because the first settlers were called the Pilgrim Fathers, they're known sometimes as the Western Pilgrims. These early settlers pushed back the limits of the known Puritan world and contributed to the legends of the so-called Wild West, which some of you might have seen in so-called Western films, and especially the cowboys versus Indians. So I've listed between brackets here some of the legendary figures of this Wild West that have been popularized by Hollywood films, American films. Okay. As you can see, they're the sort of American pioneers, and some of them are also Indian leaders, Amerindian leaders, Crazy Horse, Geronimo, and Sitting Bull. Okay, what is the American Renaissance here? First of all, on the database that I presented last week, I put it between commas. And the reason is that it's actually not a term that everybody uses, and it was first used by a critic, this one, in a book published quite a long time ago now. Yeah. And it's a term that's now has been disputed for two reasons. First, because Renaissance means that there's a renewal. That supposes that there was a birth before, but arguably this is the first major current in American literature. There was no such thing as a kind of a golden age of American literature before. It's the first golden age. Okay. And why some critics have questioned it as well is because people have said, well, it's not as if it's a kind of mastering of a new literature, but rather it marks the constellation, the gathering of several influences on various writers that have produced great works, but are not completely original in many ways. Having said this, this is indeed the flourishing period for American letters. It has contributed some of the, still nowadays, to these days, some of the best known works of American literature. Okay? So what is it? It denotes the period from about 1830 to around the Civil War. So it covers about 30 to 40 years. Some critics add later people, I would say debatably, because then a new style kicks in. Okay? And because it used to be synonymous with Romanticism, American Romanticism, precisely this is also the cutoff point for why we should stop with the Civil War, because beyond the Civil War, another kind of literature which is definitely not connected to what remains of the influence of Romanticism was written. It's also associated with a movement that is described and defined last week briefly, so-called transcendentalism, especially Emerson and Thoreau, whom I will present. Further on this slide, I give a precursor, and it's the kind of romantic and Gothic literature that were produced in the previous century. And in many ways, these people are the first major writers in American literature. And they have contributed a kind of influence to the people in this period. But the best known names associated with this period are the ones that follow in the second paragraph, and they're the ones I will present with the key texts. So Emerson's, these two texts, Hawthorne, a novelist who wrote romances, Melville, who I will deal with next week because we'll focus on the text by him, Thoreau, Walt Whitman. And to these have been added so various names that still wrote within the period. So Edgar Poe, whom we will see after Melville, known for his tales of mystery and the macabre. Dickinson, who started writing poetry in the 1950s, and somebody who's known especially for one novel, not for much else, the famous anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852. Okay. So short presentations of these people. Nathaniel Hawthorne, I try to kind of arrange them more or less chronologically, but also by groups. So I've kept the transcendentalists together. But I start first with perhaps chronologically the first one of them all, and I try to give each time a nice little caption to summarize what they stand for, and I call him the Romance of Puritan New England. Indeed, he often chooses 17th century Puritan New England as his fictional setting, so the beginnings of America. Yeah, America was founded in the 1620s, especially his hometown Salem, Massachusetts, which witnessed the famous Salem witch trials of 1692-1693. And why he's so obsessed with this is because, and what's interesting in America, it's a big country now, lots of people, but in the early stages of its history, all the big families were connected, because there are very few people that landed there, and then they sort of proliferated. So his great-great-grandfather was named John Hawthorne, that's spelled, and was a judge. And because of his role in the witch hunt, Nathaniel Hawthorne felt guilty about it, and it made him add the letter W to his family name. Okay? And later on, we'll see another family name that's important for a later descendant. So his writings question New England Puritanism, which is reflected in cultural tensions, and address the Puritan belief that humanity exists in a state of depravity. Let's not forget that why America was settled is because there were some religious Orthodox believers that felt that faith was not pure enough in England. They were persecuted in Britain, and they emigrated and founded New England, the first colonies in the United States. And they were the so-called Puritans. So, as the name suggests, they wanted a purer version of faith. Okay? And they were obsessed with humanity being a state of depravity, with sin, with moral guilt, the Puritan sense of original sin, all those notions that form the fabric and the major themes of Hawthorne's fiction. Another one that's also very important as a theme is the notion of predestination, the fact that no matter what you do, if God hasn't chosen you, hasn't elected you, you will not be saved. And this is extremely important for early literature and for one writer that I will mention later on. Hawthorne was briefly associated with the Transcendentalists during his short stay in their community at Brook Farm in '81, and I've detailed here and on the following slide the major works that he's written. I won't spend too much time on them because, well, it's a kind of short summary of what happens. You can see the title, a minister is a priest, so he clearly deals with religious institutions. And this short story, the first well-known short story, again, deals with the black veil, which is a kind of symbol that represents the sin, the inward sin of all human beings in that story. But I won't comment on the last title on this slide, but the first two are perhaps the most important work he's ever written. The Scarlet Letter, still arguably one of the best novels in American literature. Why we're not looking at those is because these are too long. Of course, they are novels, and I decided to choose short stories. But if you're interested in this period, this is one novel I recommend you to read. Again, set in the same sort of Puritan setting during the years 1640 to 1649, and it focuses on an adulteress, Hester Prynne, who is, as a sign of her sin, is attached a letter A for adultery on her. But because of, again, the Puritan doctrine of trying to redeem herself, with time she tries to kind of turn over a new leaf and tries to lead a new life based on repentance and dignity. And at some point, the letter becomes known as Abel because she sells incredibly good handiwork. We discovered that at some point in the text that her adulterous lover was actually married and was a priest. Yeah? Dimmesdale, with whom they had an illegitimate daughter, Pearl. And on election day, it's an important day, after giving an inspired sermon, he climbs upon the scaffold and confesses his sin and dies in her arms. And the husband, the former husband of Hester Prynne, who had meanwhile been seeking revenge all these years, loses will to find revenge and dies shortly afterwards and leaves her a substantial inheritance. And at the end of this novel, Hester Prynne is buried near the grave of her lover, where they share a simple tombstone engraved with the red letter A. Okay, so the letter A structures the whole tale. And what's interesting also in the way it's written is that I mentioned the theme of the American frontier, and it's full of it in there. The Western scenery and also the themes and motifs, the topoi, were influenced by Thoreau's experience at Walden Pond. Remember that Hawthorne himself, as I said, on the previous slide, stayed in that transcendentalist farm, and he was acquainted with the transcendentalist philosophy of nature and with the role of wild nature in their writings. And in a sense, some critics have argued that the novel's actions is also characterized by a lot of wildness and wilderness. A similar sort of story in The House of the Seven Gables. It's a bit more difficult to summarize this one because, again, it sort of has its roots in New England at the beginning of towards the 17th century, but it's a flashback because it's set in the mid-19th century. So it reviews the whole complexity of who inherited this house from the 17th century to the 19th century. And I'll leave you to read the summary for yourselves when you have the PDFs. What's interesting here, and I want to point out, is that the key family in this novel is called the Pynchons. And if you know contemporary literature, you will know that there's a very famous American literature called Thomas Pynchon. And again, these are his ancestors. Now, Thomas Pynchon is spelled without the E, P-Y-N-C-H-O-N. So the Hawthorns are one of the first Puritan families, so were the Pynchons. So you can see how tightly knit the community were, from which some very important names, both in the 19th and 20th century, in American literature have sprung up. Next come the two transcendentalists. So first, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Romantic philosopher. He's the one that's known for individualism, first for his essay on nature, and his major other ideals deal with freedom, the ability of mankind to realize anything, and the relationship between the soul and the surrounding world. And his best known essay, I won't comment on the second one, which you can see for yourself, is Self-Reliance. This is the best known essay by Emerson, and arguably the first essay in America that advocates a philosophy of individual independence from outside assistance, whether it's the state or the government. It's also the most thorough statement of Emerson's insistence on the need for individuals to avoid conformity, so it's called a non-conformist, and follow their own instincts and ideas. So an incredibly important essay in the tradition of individualism as it was forged throughout the 19th century and led to what I mentioned here in the first paragraph. Later, president in the United States in the 20th century talked about rugged individualism. This is one of the set phrases that characterizes the American spirit, of entrepreneurial spirit. The other well-known transcendentalist writer or frontiersman, more than Emerson, was the philosopher Thoreau. He was influenced by Romanticism, and he is best known for his reflections on simple living in natural surroundings and for his essay on civil disobedience. So there are two key texts here. First, there's one which in a sense is a kind of equivalent to Emerson's Self-Reliance. It's the one that I mentioned first, which, although there are different readings, people say, was he an anarchist or not? One could say that basically what he's trying to propose is that citizens should feel free he argues for the right of individuals to oppose an unjust state and for people not to be made agents of injustice. Okay, so rather than be led by a bad ruler, one should oppose a bad ruler. And what his essay argues is for a better type of governance. Okay, and citizens should also feel responsible for wanting better type of governance. And this essay was actually incredibly important and had an impact on some major political activists in the 20th century, India's Mahatma Gandhi, and in the United States, the Black Reverend Martin Luther King. Thoreau, as I said, was also a pioneer in his own way. He was an American romantic and a bard of the frontier. And he, for 2 years, I think it's exactly 2 years, 2 months and 2 days, for whatever reason, he lived in his own log cabin amidst woodland owned by his friend and mentor Emerson. And the account of this experiment in nature is called Walden. So it's a very interesting text because it typifies how the some American writers were influenced by the philosophy of one French writer in the 18th century that preached a return to nature because civilization could potentially corrupt man. Okay? So he wanted to show that one could live closer to nature and still not feel the need to be in society. Okay. And the last one, which I will present, and I'll spend a bit of time to see if there are questions. Walt Whitman, one of the greatest voices. This is the only major poet that strictly belongs to this tradition, unless one wishes to add the woman I mentioned previously, Emily Dickinson. And it's one that's very important for the let's say, the beginning of modernist American poetry in the 20th century, as well as for the connections at the time between poetry and politics. So he was a humanist. He was part of the transition between transcendentalism and realism. So he's already on the sort of at the latter end of the period of the American Renaissance, and incorporated both views in his work. He's often called the father of free verse because he's the first one that wrote in this unrhymed verse with characteristically long lines. And his work was very controversial at the time on account of its overt sensuality. It's incredibly sexually explicit poetry, and he was also rumored to be a homosexual, which occasionally indeed transpires in his poetry. He was the first American poet to try to find a voice that was capable of expressing the vision of what America is in its multiplicity. So he moved and he traveled from state to state and wrote what he called in particular the poems of these states, based on the year after the independence, so the 70th year or 72nd year, whatever. And each time mixing with the communities and writing, infusing about the variety and the multiplicity of what America was. And there's a famous line at the end of Song of Myself, which is one of the best known parts of the poem, this collection of poems called Leaves of Grass, in which he says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And in this kind of self-contradiction is the spirit of the variety and the multiplicity of America, okay? Because he, as a lyrical voice, tries to write something which is in between a lyrical self, writing like an autobiography in poetry, and, as I said here, a lyrical voice capable of translating the vision of what America is. So it's also a sort of epic poem founding the identity of the nation, and it's the first one of its kind. Okay? And that's what makes Leaves of Grass such an interesting poem. And in this, so it's something that he worked at from the first edition, 1855, until he died. So he kept adding to it and subtracting, so that you have now different editions of this collection of poems. And what's also very important is the so-called preface, in which, and I quote here, "The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem," where he makes the connection between the role of the poet and what a poem is and what the United States are becoming. Later editions include some very well-known poems, in particular, again, showing the relationship in his work between poetry and politics. The famous elegy to one of the most beloved American presidents who was assassinated, Abraham Lincoln, a poem called "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom." Okay, that's it from me. Any questions? We have about 5 minutes. I wanted to make sure I finished earlier because this morning I was cut off because I was too long and I didn't know what it would happen. So any questions? As I said, obviously I will also upload the presentation, so please reread it. Yeah. This again, to come back to a point that was made last week, it's not to learn, and it's not to learn by heart or anything. It's kind of background material for reference. And in this particular case, especially for ways of reading, as I said, when we had the testing week, it's just to give you a broad summary of precisely the ways in which one can analyze a text. And hopefully we'll try to pick and mix from this range of critical methods when we look at this or that text on the course. And the presentation I've just made here on 19th century American literature and history, and particularly the American Renaissance, is to give you a kind of broad context within which to locate the first two writers we'll see on this course. Next week, Herman Melville, whom I'll present first, and then 2 weeks from now, Edgar Poe. Okay, so don't be put off by the material. From now on, the PowerPoints are going to be shorter because they're going to be focusing on one writer and sometimes introducing a movement, like I did with the American Renaissance, like when I introduced modernism, for instance, or introduced postmodernism. Yeah? So they will be a bit shorter. There'll be no long marathon presentation like last week or like today. So again, any questions? I hear absolutely nothing. In fact, everybody's muted apart from a couple of people, which is also why.
No questions.
Any reactions or any questions? Okay, right. So before I forget and before we leave, so as usual, as I said, I will upload the PowerPoint. As I was presenting it, there didn't seem to see any mistakes in this one. I corrected the 2 mistakes I saw with the previous one. I don't think there were others. I'll upload them both. I have, in this particular case, done a recording, which I will stop when we finish this meeting, and I will upload this as well. And I will, you have the reader, so you know the text that we're dealing for next week. You've had now almost 2 weeks to read it. You have 1 more week. It's the longest text. It's Melville's short story. And after that, the text will be a bit shorter, which is why I said we're starting with this one. So from week to week, what I want you to do is, after I uploaded the PowerPoint, I will let you know on WeChat. You reread it before the lecture or whenever. You come with questions on the material, if need be, if things are not clear enough, could be the case. I take those questions at the beginning, then I give a lecture. Next week, as I said, it's going to be a broad presentation of Melville, especially his major work, Moby Dick. And then we have every other week, so next week we'll have one, we'll have a seminar. The idea of doing a text is that I would like people to interact more. It's a seminar, it's on a text. In other words, I'm not going to speak all the time. It's not a lecture. Yeah? And I insist on this because otherwise I have absolutely no way of assessing what you make of the text, what you understand, and what you don't. I know there are lots of people here, but you should not feel intimidated. We're not in a classroom. Each is in their own corner for the moment. So, you know, I might have to ask questions to see what you think of this or that. But the idea is to have, when we have the seminar part of this course, is for things to be more interactive. If it doesn't work out, yes, I'll have to lecture, but it's much more unpleasant because it's not meant to be a lecture. It's meant to be a seminar, okay? So the PowerPoints are fine. I'm the one who speaks and tell me there are things you don't understand and there are questions. But as far as the seminars are concerned, please be prepared to interact and have a discussion. Otherwise, it's not gonna work, and you won't get much out of it. It's only for your own sakes. Okay. So we have what, 30 seconds. One last time. Any questions? I see that half of the people only unmuted anyway. Okay, if there are no questions, then I'll stop the recording. I'll let you know on the WeChat group where I've uploaded the documents, and talk to you, interact, if possible, next week then. Thank you.
Thank